Hi there, my name is Ola Jungirius and I'm your host of our very first episode of BeamReach and Beyond. This episode is dedicated to the travel and hospitality industry. And joining us today are Rosina Budhani, Alexandra Vukolova and Uwern Jong, who will share their views and experience. In this episode, we discuss why there is such an urgent need to disrupt the industry. How can cultural intelligence boost your employees' performance and engagement? Why did the feeling of being hospitable disappear from hospitality? How pandemic pushed airlines to innovate and adopt more technology? How can travel companies enhance the experience for women, members of LGBT community, and people with disabilities, and many, many other topics? Let's dive into this conversation. All right. So welcome everyone to our podcast for the travel industry. So welcome to BeamReach and Beyond. And today we have three fantastic speakers from three different backgrounds and different experiences. And I'm really looking forward to this recording, to this beautiful conversation, because I think the perspectives and experiences are similar but very different. So we're going to be learning a lot today. So let's just kick off with introductions. I'd like to start with Rosina. So who are you? Why are you here? What is your experience with DI? And where are you?
I'm originally from the UK, but I've lived in Berlin since 2012. I spent 20 years working in public relations, so working in London and in Berlin. And I was head of PR for a boutique hospitality membership group, where I spent 8 years working with some of the most amazing, wonderful, exciting hotels across the world, which Uwern can attest to because he stayed at many of them as well. And my journey with DEI and particularly intercultural training, so I'm a qualified intercultural trainer, very much comes from that experience of working with fabulous boutique hotels around the world, but oftentimes being the only woman in the room, the only person of color in the room. But also I've worked front of house in my youth and in my 20s when I was at university. So I've got lots of personal experience where equity was needed, inclusion was lacking. And so I come into it wanting to really support and change and disrupt the industry because I think it needs that at the moment.
Yeah, I can only imagine that industry was also totally disrupted because of COVID. And it's also interesting to see how has it disrupted, because I see many hotels and many restaurants still struggling to hire, isn't it? So around the world, that's a big problem.
Yeah,
wonderful.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Yeah, wonderful. Alex, would you like to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Alex. Actually, I'm also based in Berlin, and currently I am in Berlin. Does not happen very often, but today I'm in Berlin. So I am coming from airline industry, and in the airline industry, my nickname sort of is passenger with an opinion, and that is because I used to work half of my career. I spent in top leading companies. Tech company in airline industry, but I'm also very passionate about flying and aviation. I like to post a lot about my experiences. And today I am honored actually to join this group of three experts in the topic. I'm going to share my view because, as a woman leading in a leadership role in airline industry, I learned a lot. Plus, as a passenger flying quite frequently and working with airlines to improve their passenger experience, I get to say a little bit about diversity and inclusion on board and on the ground.
Wonderful. Alex, I think we're being very modest because for you, I wouldn't be ashamed to say that you're actually the influencer, if you may call it on LinkedIn, because I'm not in the travel industry and I don't really understand much. I mean, I travel a lot, obviously, but it's really interesting to read your posts because they analyze a lot about travel experiences and being
and a lot in different airlines. So I really recommend everyone to really to go on LinkedIn and follow Alex. It's a very insightful post that you making that.
Thank you very much. You now set the bar very high. I'll do my best, to keep up.
All righty. And last but not least, Uwern. So who are you? What do you do? And what's your story?
Well, my name's Uwern Jong. My pronouns are he, him. I am editor-in-chief of OutThere magazine, which is a luxury and experiential travel magazine based in the brand values of diversity, discovery, and discernment. Much like both my fellow panelists, I am very intersectional. So it's a lived experience when it comes to diversity and inclusion. I am British Malaysian. I am a member of the LGBTQ community. So I have always been very cognizant of how I travel, or actually how people around me when I travel acts towards me. I'm by no means a workplace diversity and inclusion specialist. My whole thing is about the customer experience, which is very important, and to see much more equity and actually belonging when it comes to travel, particularly in the luxury travel industry. I'm based in London, although much like Alex, I'm very rarely here, a global citizen, so to speak, but London is home. Thank you for having me on the podcast today. Really, it is an honor to share the stage with some amazing speakers, and I'm very excited at what we're going to discuss today.
Wonderful, wonderful. It's wonderful to have you all here. And I just going to kick off with a very broad question to start a conversation, because we have a lot to cover and there's a very different perspectives we can take. But what has actually happened in travel industry? How does travel industry cater to the unique needs for minorities, for example, for solo female travelers, or for people with disabilities, or LGBTQIA plus community, or other minority groups? What are the examples that you see in the industries, whether it's airlines, whether it's hotels or restaurants, whatever you have in mind? So just share your experience globally, and what are the best practices?
I'll take that one.
Yeah.
As someone in the travel industry, I would say the bar is very low when it comes to diversity and inclusion. I have to give credit to the industry, particularly in the last few years. It's got a lot better. I think people have been a lot more aware of what's happening. And I think that's almost happened by accident. And it's also happened because of the pandemic. The pandemic gave an opportunity for people to stop and think about what was going on. And then just not only the pandemic, things in the pandemic like Black Lives Matter, Stop Asian Hate. There was a lot of sort of activism that happened in the world in the bigger picture in the world that led to companies, not just travel companies, or corporations and companies and organizations to think, actually, this is something that we really need to be good at. So while the bar is set low, I think a lot of people did it because they had to do it. But then there was also a lot of people that did it because they felt it was the right thing to do. And then there was another group of people who said, actually, you know what? This is a profitable market to be part of, to be really engaged in diversity and inclusion. Is not just good for brand, it's also good for business. So together, all those things came together, and I think people suddenly felt this is something we need to look at. So improvements and strides have been made, particularly in the last few years, to get to a better place. But I still think the bar is low. We have a long way to go. We have a lot to learn. And my hope is that in this period of sort of normal operations, as we get back to normal operations for the pandemic, that it doesn't get forgotten, and that these conversations continue to happen, so that we can make the industry a much better place.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And what do you mean by had to do it? As in, due to pandemic, because of the lack of tourism in general, and companies had to adapt? What was the external motivation for them per se?
Well, I think in the wake of Black Lives Matter, particularly, companies that weren't seen to be diverse and inclusive, it looked really bad. It just looked really bad on companies, regardless of whether we were operating as normal or not. People suddenly looked internally and said, gosh, there's so much we need to do and there's so much we're not doing. But actually, now we have the time and the consideration to do it. Obviously, we can't paint every organization with the same brush. You know, there are lots of diversity is a continuum. I always say there are lots of people on different parts of their diversity journey. There were some companies in travel who were really good at diversity and inclusion before the pandemic happened. And then a lot of people caught up. So, you know, I don't think it was because the world stopped necessarily. I just think there were a lot of different social factors at play that made people stop to think more about it. I mean, it's something that diversity inclusion is something everyone's been talking about, particularly in our specific niches, right? So as a magazine that started 10 years ago as an LGBTQ publication, I'm used to banging my hands on the door to knock the door down, to talk about diversity and inclusion. And then I felt maybe 5 or 6 years into our journey as a magazine, it got a lot easier. People were willing to listen more, but I don't think people were actioning anything much. They were talking about it a lot. And I think that's just generally what happens in the industry. People like to talk about it a lot, but don't necessarily take action. And I think it's time that we actually take action. And what I feel that what we do at the magazine to be much more action oriented rather than just talking about it, to really talk about ways that the industry is actually progressing. And also, you know, flip the script. It's not all about negativity. It's about, hey, look, let's champion the people who are doing really good things, rather than saying everyone's not doing enough. So it's a change in narrative, and I feel that that's great, gaining great momentum.
Yeah, super interesting. In a way that companies also see money, see that perhaps traditionally groups that were not financially able to travel, or different generations that, you know, in my youth, I didn't have money to travel, but the current young generation, they do have money because of the different ways to make money when you're very young, in Asian population and whatever there is, different groups that the minority before are not really interesting for the travel industry. Suddenly there's interest. And if you actually don't really understand them, you miss out on a big chunk of the market, and that there is money. That's where the industry is like, there is money. Okay, let's what is this diversity inclusion thing? Let's embrace it.
I agree. I think that the emerging middle class that's coming out of Southeast Asia and Asian markets and wanting to travel more worldwide and in Western countries, there is that kind of conversation happening in the travel industry. There's so many trade events and publications that talk about this. And then they talk about ways to engage. And then what I feel is missing is that they don't often then see the opportunities within diversity, equity and inclusion and intercultural awareness as a way to engage as well. I feel like there's a lot put on kind of travel trade relations, marketing, perhaps making their marketing more inclusive. So these are the like easy tick box options to do. And actually, as Uwern was saying, like digging a bit deeper, there's so much more that can be done to make it much more of an authentic outreach and proposition for this new emerging middle class. But also, I think when we're talking about the kind of area of disability, for example, there's one great initiative that happened in Greece last year that I wanted to share, where I think it's over 250 beaches have been made wheelchair accessible. Now, that shouldn't be big news because everyone should be doing it. And this, I think, is where you can see that, yes, strides are being taken, but the fact that that's big news means that there aren't enough strides being taken by the majority. It's the minority that are doing it. And actually, I read that the person who came up with the technology is also someone who uses a wheelchair and lives by the sea. So again, it's someone taking the initiative to improve their life and their situation, because that's a lived experience. And it can't always be put down to the minority to fix the problems, to then allow these huge, big companies to go and make the money and use it as a marketing tool. So that, I think, is the place we're at within the industry at the moment, that there needs to be that work internally for it to be more of an authentic reason rather than, yeah, we're going to get great PR out of this. Let's do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Alex?
Yeah, I agree with both of you. Travel industry, aviation specifically, we're so much behind in terms of diversity and inclusion. And what happened during pandemic specifically, airlines got a lot of free time because basically planes were grounded, no one was flying. So they started looking into areas that are underdeveloped. So airline tech improved significantly in the last 2 years. A lot of airlines invested money in mobile applications. Same with diversity. Plus now, when the industry is recovered much faster than everyone was expecting, actually, we need more people joining airline industry. And that's where, again, airlines are investing heavily into diversity and inclusion. They want, more women to join, more minority groups to join, and they focus heavily on promoting those. And I agree with you, Rosina, that, it should be a norm, but it's still not a norm, and it's still making to the news. Like last week, one of the airlines in the US, JetBlue, they will have a female CEO now, and it made all the way to global news everywhere in the world, just because this is the first time major US airline is getting a female CEO. I mean, we are living in 2024 now. This should be a norm. That should make global news, but still everyone is happy and everyone is cherishing. And yeah, we are so inclusive and diverse. This should be a norm, really, not an exception.
I think the issue is that actually the norm is still, like I say, the bar is set really low. If you look at the leadership of whether it's aviation or hospitality or, any kind of travel industry, it's the boardroom and the C-suite is still predominantly white male. And that's something that has to change. And, people ask me, is that institutional bias? Is it institutional racism? Is it institutional, anti-feminism? That's very hard to say. Of course, as someone who has had the lived experience, we understand what it's like to be in those positions and not being able necessarily to get to the top or not have people give you the leg up to the top. But that's the reality of the situation. And that's why, allyship is very important. Because it's not just about, like Rosina says, people from minority backgrounds banging the drum, or as I said, beating the door down to talk about diversity and inclusion. It's got to be led from the bottom up, but also from the top down. And the organizations in the travel industry that are doing really good, it comes from the top down a lot of the time. It comes from allyship. It comes from someone that stands up and say, actually, this is not right. And this is what we need to do. We need to give women an equal playing field. We need to give people with disabilities the tools they need to come to work. We need to, to have senior leaders that are people of color, because all that representation really matters, because then the decision making will be far more reflective of what the real world is really like. Which I think is a brilliant segue into workplace diversity.
Yeah, absolutely. It's basically very, very basic marketing, isn't it? Like if you don't really have a very diverse group of people represented, then you just catering to a very homogeneous group of people, you're missing out on it makes me, to be frank, really angry when a lot of leaders think, okay, yes, diversity inclusion is very important, but we have other business priorities and we have bottom line, whatever not. Diversity and inclusion is not about charity work. It's not really about just moral thing or ethical thing. It's pure business thing. If you actually understand it, it's all about attracting the right people, keeping the right people. Because if you have a high employee turnover, that's very, very costly to you. Or if you have no psychological safety in a workplace, then people are not going to be engaged, not going to be performing 100%. If people make mistakes, they don't report mistakes because simply they're afraid that it's going to be very costly and going to affect your business decisions. I'm really curious to hear your perspective on, so for example, if I'm someone who is in the travel industry, but I'm representative of a power group, I'm a cisgender male, I'm white, I'm in my 40s, I don't have lived experience, but I do understand and I respect people from different diverse backgrounds, but I don't really understand the needs. can you maybe share some examples of how the experiences of minority groups could be different when they explore the world? And what kind of actions companies do to actually prioritize safety, inclusivity for minority groups to travel and make the experience different from the majority group that doesn't really need those needs?
I read an interview recently with a CEO from a big hospitality group, and he was saying, he was really patting himself on the back because he was like, I know all my staff's names. I know all the housekeepers' first names. And it really fills them up with so much pride when I see them walking down the corridor in the morning and I say, hey, good morning. And I use their first name to greet them. And he really was patting himself on the back. And I think this person very much can represent your example there, Ola. That's just not enough. Knowing somebody's first name is like basic, like being a manager, being a leader, right? You know the person's name. And yes, if we talk about a hotel where you have a lot of staff, and if it's a big property, you could have over 100, 200 staff members going from the kitchen staff through to housekeeping and beyond. But I think that one of the issues within the industry is that there are many people that work behind the scenes. So you have front of house, you have reception. And that, again, I'm talking specifically for hotels here. So maybe Alex can talk more about the aviation aspect. There are many people that work in a hotel who don't sit behind a desk, who don't sit at a computer all day to do their job, that may not have access to a computer, that may not have access to a smartphone. And I think oftentimes within the industry where surveys are sent, for example, it's not being actually carried out by the people that we really need to hear from, because they may not have, first of all, they may not even know the survey exists because their job is in the kitchen or in housekeeping, they're in the laundry. But secondly, maybe English, if it's done in English, isn't their first language. Maybe they need some support to have the questions in their native language so they're able to answer them authentically. And maybe when they do, and I actually did hear this from someone in the industry, I said, how do you make sure that the staff that you have that don't have access to a computer are able to fill out your survey? And they said, oh, I invite them into my office and they fill it out with me. That's not okay. That's really not okay. So, and I know this is also an issue with companies where they have a lot of delivery drivers or people working in factories. So this isn't unique to the hospitality industry. And those other industries definitely have found ways to get to all of the staff. Whereas what I'm finding in hospitality is that they haven't necessarily put the additional effort and budget in to make sure that they're hearing from all of the diverse voices across the organization. So I think one thing that can be done is, if you're a GM of a hotel, go and spend 2 days in each department across the year. Because it might have been a very long time since if you work your way up, which many GMs do, they do work very hard. It's a really tough job being a GM. Maybe it's a long time since you were working on the service floor in the restaurant, but go and work there for 2 days and spend time with the staff, spend time doing the job that you're paying and employing them to do, so you can have that first-hand experience. The same with the laundry, the same with the housekeeping. And so you can learn the difficulties that they're having to go through daily, and that you can learn more about them than just their first name. That, I think, is the important point.
Wonderful. What about, and I really love what you're saying about understanding everyone on the floor and understanding different perspectives, because we have our own biases, isn't it? And then we have our specific assumptions of what the life could be, especially when you office clerk and then you imagine that everyone is sitting the whole day in front of the computer. That's not really reality. And there is also, there seems that majority of people, or a lot of people in hospitality, in travel industry, are the ones that very often are migrants. Yeah, they're not locals, and they also don't know their rights. They don't really understand the law. They don't really understand what is the right treatment. And very often it's also people who are employed illegally. And that's where also the part of equity coming in and equality, where you don't really pay people fairly, and when you don't really treat them fairly. And that's also a big problem in the industry. And I see in many hospitality, in many restaurants, at least in New Zealand, there was a big problem in New Zealand. I grew up in New Zealand, and I was there just in February. And New Zealand was closed for 3 years for non-residents and non-citizens. And the majority of tourism industry, majority of hospitality industry, there were people working holiday visa. So there were lots of Europeans, a lot of people from South America coming to New Zealand for 1 year to travel around and explore the country and working in restaurants. And due to the fact that New Zealand was not giving any visas for 3 years, almost 3 years, the industry completely collapsed. And you could see all restaurants just closed down simply because there was no one to employ. There were no international people coming, international young people. There were no international students being employed. And then also the industry, they had to raise salaries because of that, simply because they was not able to, in order to attract locals to work in the industry. And that also quite interestingly affected the industry in prices and so on and so forth. So I'm also curious from your perspective regarding equity and equality, Rosina, in hospitality, how does it affect, and what do companies do to actually address that, if there is a need for that for them?
Yeah, there's a huge need, as your example points out. I mean, that's just New Zealand, right? And I think post-pandemic, which you highlighted in the intro, that there's a huge issue when it comes to staff and staff attraction within the industry, and also then staff retention. And from my perspective, this is where intercultural awareness and intelligence really comes into play. Because if you, as a hospitality organization, I mean, it's an incredibly diverse industry. It's incredibly diverse, but it's lacking the equity. And it's also lacking that sense of belonging for many people. So if you are a hospitality organization and you are employing people from outside of the region and the market that you're operating in, I think it's your duty to provide those people and everybody within the organization with intercultural training so that you can understand each other. That's first and foremost. You can have cultural appreciation for each other before any kind of cultural problems start coming in, because I think this is what I'm hearing from hospitality leaders, is that oftentimes with staff, and you have a very diverse workforce, there's issues coming in. And if there isn't that cultural appreciation put in place, then this can grow and grow. And then you expect them to go and work together all day. And oftentimes with seasonal properties, the staff actually live together as well. So the impact on people is huge. But there's so much more that needs to be done in terms of hearing the voices. Again, it goes back to that idea of having more conversation and more opportunity and having the psychological safety within the workplace to allow everybody to come and share their points of view, their dreams. Perhaps someone wants to stay within the housekeeping team and they're really happy there. That's brilliant. Perhaps someone from housekeeping has the dream to go and move up to reception and beyond. Without asking people that, you're never going to know. And I think within the industry, rather than constantly employing externally, there's the opportunity to employ internally and to provide promotions, providing the equity, the training, the additional education to employ and bring your staff members up, and then kind of keep funneling that through. And that loyalty and that sense of belonging is going to grow and grow. And that's only going to support the industry. And then that same feeling is going to go through to the new people coming in. But again, I think that there's just this thing in the industry of like, hospitality schools are part of this as well. I don't know what the situation is within aviation, Alex, with the training, but hospitality schools, especially in Europe, are so one-dimensional from my perspective. There's a lot of young, wealthy, white students coming into the industry, and they're coming in at more senior positions than perhaps someone who's worked at that property for a very long time with just a little bit more training would be more qualified than them. So this is the kind of unequal balance within it at the moment.
Yeah, spot on. I think like in aviation industry, it is a very, very male-dominated environment. I used to go to a lot of events and conferences, and honestly, you don't see a lot of women, not at all. And then you see those top managers, male, older guys, right? And all exactly as you said, they are not people who travel and observe what is happening on board and how minority groups feel. They, sit in their business class or first class, seat and enjoy their champagne. I don't want to make a judgment or make a stereotype about it, but unfortunately, that's the reality for many, many companies, right? But the harsh reality is that if you are a minority group, it's incredibly hard for you to travel. For someone in a wheelchair, it's still almost impossible to fly. Last year in Hamburg, there was a passenger experience expo, and one seat manufacturer came up with a super new innovative idea of a seat designed for wheelchair passengers. But again, this should have been done long ago. I feel a lot of people are, they have some sort of disabilities. They are in a wheelchair, and specifically for wheelchairs, that's a big problem, apparently, to check it in, because the ground handling is not very careful with bags, as we might know from our own experience, right? And those wheelchairs, when a passenger checks it in and someone brings him to the standard seat, right? When this wheelchair is checked in, if something happens to the wheelchair, it's so costly to repair it. So many people just prefer not to fly at all because they don't want to risk their wheelchair. And this is just, one example. Something more like basic is only, I think, a few years ago, airlines changed their announcement from "Dear ladies and gentlemen" to "Dear passengers," just because someone could maybe not identify with either of the groups. A lot of happening, and still there is a very big room for improvement, I feel, in airline industry specifically.
I recently seen, I can't remember which, I think it was in Spain, one of the airlines, there was like a big poster that said, if you are neurodivergent, or if you're on a spectrum, you could use this kind of blue columns, so blue, I can't remember, lanyard or whatever not, just for staff members to identify you in, provide you additional accommodation. Are you familiar with that? Do you know any other examples of other airlines?
Actually, in Berlin Airport, they have this program, Sunflower, it's called. So you can go to the airport desk and ask for this badge or whatever is that. To basic staff will know that you have some sort of thing that you need a little bit, maybe more time, more attention. You don't have to have anything related to your health. Maybe you just don't feel comfortable in crowded places, and you can go and ask for this Sunflower. So staff would know, to be maybe a little bit more patient with you. I think we need more of those programs, honestly.
Do you think it should be more on the governmental level, on the country level, rather than airlines, specific airlines doing that?
It should come from governments, in my opinion, in relation to airlines and in relation to travel sector. This is the area that my feeling is still very much underlooked. A lot of things to improve, but yeah, it should come from government. But governments are, honestly, they're busy with something else, specifically in the airline industry, with emissions and stuff, and putting bans on certain flights, which I don't want to say this is not important. This is important, but this is a very global issue, right? But we should also look at the smaller issues, smaller for the governments, but those small issues for the governments are incredibly huge for people who are traveling or who cannot travel because of this.
I totally agree. I think, but I think the word is empathy. The hospitality industry, by its very nature, with the word hospitable, has to be hospitable, and we're not. I don't know what happened along the way. We got to a place where it's about speed, it's about money, it's about the amount of time the airplanes on the tarmac. It's about how many people you can serve going through your reception at very one time. So it becomes this process of just getting everyone becomes a statistic, just getting people through the door as quickly as possible. And as a result, what happens there, we fail in empathy. And, the idea that we have to give people a sunflower just to be nice to them or to be considerate of someone is actually quite bonkers. We are a human race. We come in many different shapes and sizes. Not everyone is fully able. And actually, I think it's a staggering statistic. Actually, it's more like 60% who are not actually fully able, whether it's a hidden disability or it's a physical disability. And, it's the same thing when you see an elderly person passing through, or an, elderly person who has not traveled very much, particularly in the US. I see people shout at people. And it's a really interesting scenario. And when it comes to the LGBTQ community or the trans community, not to understand that people who may not be gendered, that they have specific needs. It all comes from empathy. And I think this also it leads to what you were saying, Ola, earlier about unconscious bias. That's the biggest deal. We've got to get rid of it. And the only way we can get rid of it is through training and is through lived experience. And yes, while people may not have that lived experience, they have to be able to acquire that lived experience. It only happened to me actually just a couple of days ago. I was at a very big travel industry event, 1,500 award dinner. And I was standing in a corner because the event was going on, and I wanted to take a look at the stage on returning to my table. And I was beckoned over by a woman who asked me to get her some drinks, thinking that I was a waiter. Just because you've seen a person of color in a suit standing on the side of the floor, you immediately think, they're a waiter. And this was a person who also knew me,
Wow.
And it's just a really, really strange moment of, hang on, I know who you are, you know who I am, and you still ask me for drinks. But there's this unconscious bias that thinks a person of color that's standing in a room must be waiting staff, right? And that there's a lot of that in that industry. Someone, in Asia particularly, most GMs are white.
Yeah.
Right? And particularly Swiss or French or German. Going back to what Rosina's saying, it's quite bizarre when you've got this huge proportion of the world, that is ethnically diverse and has people that are more than capable. And you still think that a white person is a better GM than a local person, right? And it's the problem with corporations, it's the problem with owners, and the issues continue throughout the industry at every level. You talked about women in aviation. And on the other side of that as well, you've got people who don't want to step up to the mark because they feel they don't belong. It's not a hospitable environment to work in that environment, because why would you put yourself through that kind of stress when you could get a better job elsewhere? So actually, not only are we not encouraging people who come from minorities to enter the market, we are discouraging them. We are actively discouraging them, because what we're saying is that we lack empathy. We have unconscious bias. So you will not belong here, and therefore you will never thrive here. And that's the problem we're seeing. So it's a two-way street. It's not just that there's a lack of people and there's institutional racism or homophobia or whatever, whatever issue there is. You are not creating a culture of belonging. And as a result, people don't feel they want to get into that industry. And as you were saying with your situation in New Zealand, there's a lot of that. Young people don't want to get into the industry. Young people of color, young people who are women feel that they're going to be discriminated against. So why should I be in this industry? It's quite perplexing. And you're right. It does make me angry. But until we can create this culture of belonging, until we can create more empathy, until we can get rid of unconscious bias, until we can train people better, all these things, this stuff will continue to happen. And going back to my first point, we've got to stop just talking about it. We've actually got to do it. So many organizations constantly talk about it. And I've seen organizations through my career and even just in OutThere for the last 13 years. I've been in this industry, people who are still having the same conversation today that they did 13 years ago, and then patting themselves on the back for engaging in this conversation. We've just got to stop it. We've just got to stop it, and we've got to actually do something about it.
I love what you're saying. It's definitely a lot to unpack. And especially when you want to attract keep the key people in your company, and they don't see themselves striving, and they don't have role models. They don't see anyone who looks like them in leadership position. So what's the point of staying? What is the point of staying there and really suffering, especially, looking at salaries? They haven't, after pandemic, people do see themselves, okay, it's a risky job to take. Perhaps I should, go somewhere else. And the industry is suffering. And also regarding what you're saying about disability, last time I checked, 15% of population, or 1 billion people really, have some sort of disability. And that's something that every industry needs to consider. So 15% of our clients have some sort of disability, and it's very likely to be invisible. And 15% of our employees have some sort of disability, or chronic disability. And that it does affect the experience at work. It does affect their needs.
And it's going to get worse, because it's not going to get worse. Worse is the wrong word. Sorry, wrong word. It's going to get bigger. The market's going to get bigger.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's going to be lots of people aging into disabilities of some description.
Yeah.
And people understanding mental health much more. And the importance of breeding a strong culture of empathy and mental health is also super important. So this market is this is what tires me. We talk about ourselves being a minority often, but we're only a minority because other people have said that we're a minority.
Yeah.
When you add the sum of all these parts together, whether it's disability, age, women, LGBT, it's actually not 15%. It's more like 80%.
Yeah.
Of the market travels in some way or feels differently when they work in the travel industry. And it's something we really need to address.
Yeah, it's all about
isn't
power.
It depressing that we include women in the minority, quote unquote, group? Women, really?
I know, it's over 50%
really
of the population. Yeah, but it is, because women are still treated like a minority. And from a travel experience, whether you're, outside of the workplace, women actually go through some very harrowing things when they travel. It's really challenging. And the issue is, I don't want to just say the issue is men, but the issue is the industry that doesn't create a secure space for women when they travel. Not just solo females, but just, that it doesn't always have to be huge discrimination or an act of violence. Oh, heaven forbid that happen, but just little passive aggressions that happen on an everyday. Like some people asking solo female travelers where their husband is when they travel. Firstly, it's really annoying because you've paid for this holiday, and why do I need a man to be in a situation? But it also puts you in a situation of lack of safety, because you suddenly got to come out or diverge to someone that you're traveling alone, and that can be difficult in that situation too. So going back to my point, I know you want to move on to a different question now, but empathy is super important. And the lack of unconscious bias, we've just got to change that.
No, I'm actually very curious to hear about some specific best practices that travel industry uses. Either it's a hotel, resorts, or whatever. What kind of things what are the best practices that companies do to actually cater to them, quote unquote, minority groups and not actually minority groups. What are best examples of safety or just inclusivity that you have observed from your experience?
There's in Berlin, there's a group called the Pink Pillow Group, and the name is for me it's slightly problematic because I think it's stereotyping, but the positive side is, and it's been around for 10 years, I think, it's a group of hotels within Berlin that have signed up to this pledge to be a safe and inclusive and welcoming space for people from the LGBTQIA plus communities. So I think that is super important. I think it's sad that we need to have that needs to exist in the first place. But I think the fact that it does is hopefully encouraging other properties and newer properties that are opening and other cities and destinations to see, okay, we need to do something more here to make our spaces safer for everybody. So I think the initiative is great. I think that that there's possibly more that can be done. And I'm actually curious to know if being part of that organization means that you have to have a certain amount of training for your staff. Is it just signing up and saying, yay, great, we love gay people, we love lesbians, brilliant, bring on the trans guests. We're not going to ask if you're father and son or if you're just good friends, you can be married here in a same sex relationship. Or is it actually, we are going to make sure that these properties have invested in training to actually make sure they really are inclusive and they really are welcoming. So that's like, have they got gender neutral bathrooms in public spaces, for example, and for their staff? Do they have the same facilities for their staff as they do for guests? Because in my experience, staff are massively overlooked when it comes to prayer facilities, food, dietary requirements, religious holidays. Guests can have it all, but when it comes to staff, you don't count. And that's like, for me, that's one of the biggest problems within the industry. So the pink pillow side, I think is great. And I think that there's a lot of questions for me around that I'd love to get answers to, but I think it's a good initiative.
I think just to echo what Rosina's saying, I think agree. But let me start by saying any initiative in advancing diverse audiences or creating belonging and a culture of belonging for people is a good thing. How in depth and how watertight those programs are, that's down to each individual program. But I think it's a really good step that people are actually creating these programs. I have been part of what is the IGLTA, the International LGBTQ Travel Association, for the last 8 years. I stepped off the board this year, and my sort of lasting legacy on the board was to create an accreditation program which addresses all the things that Rosina actually said. So it's an 8-point action-based program that is audited. It's like the B Corp of LGBTQ inclusivity, which looks at staff policies, which looks at training, which also looks at marketing, and also looks at guest satisfaction, which is a very important part of that, because until you've got guest testimonials and saying that this is actually a property that I feel has really done a lot for the LGBTQ community, you don't score. So it's called IGLTA accredited, and the program started at the end of midway through last year, and they're already gaining a lot of traction. But that sort of action-based accreditation is important. And I know there's the same thing in disability. I know there's the same thing when it comes to single female travelers, because I've been engaged in all of that. Costa Rica has a program which I completely forgot what it's called. Bear with me. I can actually look it up because I was just writing about it. It's a program called the Sophia Network, and it's a network for women where hoteliers and DMCs and transport companies come together to track people through their journey through Costa Rica. So when you're moving from one hotel to another, one hotel will report when you have left and they will make sure that the other hotel on the other end checks in with the program to say that you have arrived, so that wherever you go, there's someone looking after you to some degree. So as a solo female traveler, you can feel safe in that destination. And that is a government-driven destination, a tourist board driven initiative to do that. And there are loads of great examples. There are loads of great examples around the world, people doing good. So when I said earlier that my shift had been to focus on people doing positive things as a role model and example, I think that's really important. There are states in the US that have particularly, I think it's Tennessee or Virginia, where the autumn colors are really important. They've installed observation pieces for people who are colorblind, for example, so that they can see the difference between brown and orange and yellow at that time of year. There are people in disability who are doing fantastic things. There's a property in the Maldives called Amila, who has really gone to town on better physical disability enhancements, which is impossible in the Maldives, because first you got to get on a boat or an airplane. Not only got you to travel a long way, you arrive, then you got to get on a boat or a very small seaplane before you can get to a resort, which is usually on an island and with piers and sand, and it's just very difficult for people who have physical disabilities. So they've turned around and said, we're going to turn that on its head and create an island resort, which is very accessible. And that has really made a big difference. They have, I think in the last 6 months of the program, they've increased their revenue by 30% just from these people alone. And they're going even much further now to talk about things, hidden disabilities or hidden requirements, whether it's things like perimenopausal or people who can't swallow, who eat differently. So, catering has to be different. Just because you're on resort and you can't swallow or taste doesn't mean you've got to have sludge food all the time. So there are lots of amazing initiatives happening in this world, as well as people who are creating products specifically for communities, where it's group of Black travelers going to experience Black America, or women who will go into destination to see how other women are empowered, or LGBTQ communities, where we've been doing that for a long time, whether it's cruises or activities specifically for the community, whether it's pride festivals or on resort activities. So there is a lot of good going on in the world. There's a lot of people doing it, but I think we need to step out of the niche part of it, and we got to make it part of the mainstream, so that these lessons are applied to everyone. So the culture changes to say, actually, it's not just about attracting one group, it's about being able to attract everybody.
I love what you're saying, and it's very heartwarming to hear all the stories. We have some of our listeners who work in the travel industry and have, whether they have decision power or not, they listen to the stories and see it's all possible, and it's all ideally becomes not an exceptional example, but becomes part of a default, isn't it? Because if we make it inclusivity for if you make it inclusive for one specific group, it actually benefits everyone. It's not that you're taking away from someone. It's not like it's a piece of cake that you're taking away from someone.
No,
it actually benefits everyone, isn't it? So
I did this amazing trip in Venice that was designed for people who are hard of sight, who couldn't see, who are blind or hard of sight. And it was eye-opening, wrong choice of word. It was eye-opening to me, because I experienced a destination in a completely different way. I smelt more than I've ever smelt. I heard more than I've ever heard. And as a fully able seeing, hearing person, I would have skipped all of those things. I didn't smell the bread coming out of this. I didn't look at, I didn't hear the church bells or how many tones the church bells are playing. But this was something that was, brought out on purpose for people who couldn't see. But actually, as a person who could see, it actually really enhanced my experience. So that's an example of how, catering to what is a minority or niche group can actually benefit everyone.
yeah, beautiful. It actually makes you all be more present. Yeah, I remember one of the examples not related to travel industry. It's fintech. I think it was MasterCard. So MasterCard created 3 different cards, physical cards, that it's debit, credit, and whatever. But they decided to create those cards, and they changed a little bit of a shape. So the corners were a little bit different. So it's like a triangle or the circle and whatever not. So people with hard of seeing could also sense them and be able to use the proper card and be able to understand. And it was even viral because a lot of people reported, yes, I am fully able to see, but it's so much easier even for those who don't have such health issues to identify the card when it's in the dark, or whether, I don't know, you're drunk, I don't know, whatever not there is. So it's a lot easier for people to use the card, and it's actually created a sense of awareness for everyone. So as you said, it enhances the experience for absolutely everyone. Now I'm actually curious. I was looking at your last posts, Alex, and I remember some of your posts I found very interesting. You tackle a lot about accessibility in different apps, in aviation, when someone is booking a trip, or when someone is trying to imagine what is the 12-hour flight is going to be about. So what kind of accessibility practices are there? Is it good? Is it bad? How has it changed? What is your view on that?
Okay, I think you talked about hospitality. For airlines, I feel we are still a little bit behind everything. There is a lot of happening in the airline industry, but still sort of basic things that should have happened earlier. So I give you an example, and this is not about passengers, but this is about crew. Traditionally, female crew would wear a skirt, right? And male crew would wear trousers. And only recently, airlines started changing that into, okay, you are female, but you want to wear trousers and not skirt, right? Or crew with tattoos on their body. There are only very, very few airlines in the world that if you have a tattoo, you can actually be a crew member. Historically, that is not allowed, right? So a lot of things happening in terms of diversity and inclusion for crews. Airlines are investing heavily into attract more female pilots. But still, it's a very underrepresented group. And in fact, as a passenger, a few months ago, I was on board of an airplane and I heard the voice of the captain, and that was her. She was female. And I got very excited. I get very excited every time I hear a female captain. I'm like, oh, amazing. I feel like she's doing something great. She's breaking through. But the passenger next to me, he said, well, I hope she knows how to fly this machine. And, this is a problem. We still hear a lot of this, not only from companies, from airlines, but also from fellow passengers, not trusting into capabilities of female pilots. I know I don't answer exactly to your question, Ola, because you asked about more accessibility. But this is just to give you an example that still I think we are a little bit behind. And for people with disabilities as passengers, as I said, it is very problematic. If you look at IT system, entertainment system, I mean, only very few airlines invested into creating something, for like passengers who are blind or deaf. This is entertainment, another topic, and which is actually more important, safety instructions. Still, not every airline is, tackling this and adjusting it to every group of passengers who might not understand the standard way of their information giving, a lot of things should be done when we look at boarding passes. The traditional boarding pass, if you're a blind person, there is no way you could identify anything. It's just a piece of paper, right? I can't really talk about mobile applications because I don't have experience, I don't have disability that I could, command and experience it. But even as a person with no visible disabilities, I could say that some of the mobile applications are very, very underdeveloped. And even I'm capable of seeing and hearing, sometimes I cannot navigate my way. So I can't imagine how complicated and how challenging that is for someone who actually has disability. So long story short, I feel airline industry, we still have a very, very long way. Some airlines are investing heavily into this, but still the pace, I feel, is slower than it should be, to gather this minority group, again, quote unquote, but minority group that is actually not a minority, as Uwern said.
Yeah. I remember I think 3 years ago, the Ukrainian airline, if I'm not mistaken, is called SkyUp. They allowed, it's even ridiculous when you say that. So, the female stewardesses were allowed to wear pants and flat shoes, during flights. And it was a massive, massive, massive news. And you're thinking about why on earth it is happening just now. Why on earth would you need to wear a skirt and have to wear stockings during the flights, which is probably the worst thing. You could have, so many 1,000 miles up, from the ground. And also, and it had become a very, very big news, everywhere.
I don't know if you saw the Virgin Atlantic release and campaign they took around uniform, gender neutrality. I mean, it was a big deal. As Alex has said, the airline industry still has those structures and unconscious bias, which doesn't necessarily let them advance in that. But like you said, to have uniforms that are gender neutral, to have a campaign that shows that people can be themselves, that women don't have to put their hair up in a particular way because that still exists. Women are not grounded after a particular time because that still exists, across the world. Those things really need to change. Yeah. And I think, again, to be able to highlight those positive movements where people are doing good is really important for the industry, because hopefully all will follow. Like you say, salutations, whether it's dear passengers or actually when you're booking, you can still, on many airlines, you can only still be a Mr., Miss, or Ms.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Mrs., Mr., Mrs., or Ms. And that's incredible. And that in 2024, people are still not cottoning on to that. And actually, sometimes I feel there is a willful discrimination in that point, because people just don't want change for some reason. And I don't understand why people don't want change. Is it scary? Is it all these things are not scary things. I'm often, for example, stuck in arguments or debates about the use of pronouns. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter to the other person, but it matters to the person who wants to use that pronoun. So why are people still willfully resisting the fact that this person wants to be who they are, or want to identify as in a particular way? It's incredible that this still happens today, and it's something we have to change.
I was just going to say another simple example from airline industries, amenity kits. If you fly in premium cabin, you would get an amenity kit. But this amenity kit is designed either for female or male. But they never ask you which one you want to get. They assume by default, okay, you look like female, you want to get a female amenity kit. It happened to me on my recent flight. I fly with this airline a lot, and I honestly really love their amenity kits. It's a very nice, very well-designed bag. But I have a lot of female version, and I just wanted, because I'm so passionate about it, I wanted to get a male version because it looks equally as good. So when they came to me, they assume, of course, that I want the red one because I'm female. This is female amenity kit, makes sense. And I said, sorry, can I get the other one? She looked at me and said, yeah, but this is for female. I said, yeah, I know. I fly a lot with your airline, but I have plenty. I have entire, a box of those. I want the other one. She said, actually, I need to check. I'm not sure we can do it. And right there, I felt like, oh my God, you're ruining it for me. Like, I really love your airline. And just because, so what happened then? She actually gave me the male amenity kit. But then 5 minutes after, she came to me and said, you know what, we actually ran out of men's amenity kits, so I have to take it back from you. But I was sneaky enough. I opened it already right there and started putting all the creams all over my face. Sorry. I just thought I already opened it. I really wanted that one. So yeah, but this is just the point. It's a very basic example. It's a tiny thing, but even those tiny things, you know, we are not there in terms of being diverse and inclusive. Stereotypes all over the place. That's my feeling.
But that's what I mean by those passive, massive microaggressions. They still happen. They're little things that happen. Okay, this is an extreme example because, you know, it's a gendered example, but it happens everywhere. I often say to brands when they ask me how can we be more diverse and inclusive of people, I say, you know, a simpler thing as having more vegan options in your menu, because veganism is important, but actually it's to vegans, but it's actually important to a lot of religions too. And you know, the idea that you can cater for this, it's not a special thing. It's not something that we have to go and cook specially or pull out from the kitchen. That you have a range of food items that, you know, appeals to a wider range of people who don't eat meat is important, you know? And also I say to people, set up a table for one for once in your life. Why are tables always set up for two or four, right? Why is there always this coupling? Why is it always pairing? And I've seen it. I sat in hotels where people were women, solo females, come down for breakfast or lunch, and they say, oh, you can't sit there because that table's set up for two, which is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. You know, it's like, why can't they sit there? And it comes from, you know, and I speak to a lot of women travelers and they say this is the case because they think you're alone and there's no romance. You don't need a nice view. You don't need a nice table. So, you know, you can't sit alone at the nice table because it feels uncomfortable to the institution, to the hotel. It's a very strange thing. There so many of those things that are standard practice in hospitality that we term as good hospitality. Ladies and gentlemen who serve ladies and gentlemen. One of the biggest iconic, you know, taglines of one of the biggest luxury hotels of all time is so dated. You know, it's things we still think are standard. We still think that 2.4 children, white, blonde in marketing seems to be the status quo. I will tell you 90% of luxury travel ad marketing looks like that when the world looks so different today, you know. And we talk in this industry a lot about multi-generational families, groups of people who travel together. Those groups are so mixed. They're so mixed more than ever before. And diversity and inclusion does not just depend on, it does not apply to the customer. It applies to the group that they're traveling in. Many parents may have gender neutral children or a disabled child. You know, it's not always the customer that we have to pay attention to. There's always someone in the traveling party that may have diverse needs as well.
I see a lot of this coming from the hospitality schools. So I've had a lot to do with them over the years, the European ones. And there is a uniform that the students have to wear within the hospitality school, which up until recently for most of them has been very traditional. So you can link that to then what they will be expected to wear on property or working in aviation if they're a steward or stewardess or a pilot. And so again, those very traditional rules are there from the educational setting from the get-go. And then of course it gets increased as they kind of move through the institution. And from my personal perspective, I think this then becomes very problematic when you have students coming from communities where they have certain ways of dressing and expressing themselves through their dress that isn't then supported within the hospitality school, first of all. And if part of their education is then having an internship in the industry, if there's a young woman who wears hijab or burqa and she needs to have an internship to finish her hospitality education, she's going to be really restricted in terms of what available internships they're going to be for her. There's not going to be many properties within Europe that are going to be willing to put her in the reception, in the front of house, because they're going to be discriminating against her because of her religion. There's absolute fact this is happening. And even when it comes to luxury travel and in the offices, there's still huge issues there as well with this bias and this Islamophobia and racism. And then again, it goes through into the properties. So it's just, I think at the educational level, there's so much that can be done to then support throughout this whole journey within the hospitality sector. But I just don't think it's being acknowledged at the moment.
I also want to say, it's actually really simple. we talk about this and obviously it is in our industry and it's our passion subject. And a lot of people start to get frightened when they hear us speak because they think, oh my God, this is such a huge topic, right? And it's insurmountable and it's going to take years to tackle. It's actually not. Yes, you've got to be willing to put the investment and the time aside, but it's actually quite simple. It's actually quite a simple thing to execute, and it's a simple thing. And I think that's sometimes the barriers. And I often sit there and think about what the barriers are because I'm someone who wants to overcome those barriers. And I often feel that the barriers is actually taking that first step. It's actually saying, I want to be this inclusive business, and therefore I'm going to invest in it, and therefore I'm going to make it happen. Because a lot of people would listen to this podcast and go, oh my God, I've just listened to an hour of amazing stuff, but I don't know where to start.
Yeah, people get overwhelmed.
And we've talked about women, we've talked about vegans, we've talked about disabled people, we've talked about LGBTQ people, we've talked about people of color, we've talked about people who are old, we've talked about staff. It is a lot. It sounds like a lot, but actually it's not, because yes, we have to be respectful of each requirements of each of those individual niches, but actually the application of a culture of empathy and a culture of eliminating unconscious bias and a culture of belonging applies to every single one of those people who currently do not feel represented in the industry. So once you can crack one of those, right, you can actually, it opens up the door to a culture of treating people for who they are and not imposing your standards on them.
I think I completely agree with that. I think a lot of companies, they get overwhelmed by diversity inclusion. They get very scared. I think for many people, for many organizations, especially very traditional ones, it is very scary and there's a lot of fear and a lot of them get paralyzed. It's like, where do we start? Where do we start? Oh my God.
Or not wanting to do something wrong.
Exactly.
That's the biggest problem.
They're afraid to make a mistake. And especially if you're majority group that has power, if you're white, cisgender, a heterosexual male in your 50s, and you might have good intentions, but you're so paralyzed because, to be frank, that's what I really don't like what's happening in the industry. There is a lot of finger pointing. There is a lot of blame. And there is a lot of, this is your fault because you're male. This is your fault because you're white. This is your fault because you're X, Y, that. And I personally don't think it's a very helpful conversation for anyone. Because first of all, we don't have a dialogue, and diversity inclusion is all about a dialogue. And we also need to hear those groups that do have power, because they are the ones that can actually make a difference. They can actually the ones to make a change, and not blame them and, send them on a guilt trip. And my point is that for a lot of organizations, it's very overwhelming. But if you're listening to that and you are overwhelmed, I think the best step is really, first of all, to understand where are you doing well, where you don't do so well, doing the basic assessment of your organization, where you're at, what is the low-hanging fruit for you to implement tomorrow. For example, as easy as to change the language on your website to make it more inclusive. Very easy. It will take you half a day to implement that. And things like knowing what is a long-term solution and what can you need to change long-term, and also listening to your employees and listening to your customers, understanding where the problem is at. Because very often organizations say, okay, let's just do something regarding DI, and they get really excited and they get really, really passionate about it. And then they see this massive mountain that they need to climb and they get very discouraged. And I think it's all about taking a small step at a time and not, we can't really change the world. We can't really change the company overnight. And it's
my point is you can.
Yes,
I believe you actually can.
But it takes time. It takes time and it takes money.
It takes time and it takes effort, but you can. You've got to make that first step, because I think that notion of you can't change something overnight, therefore I don't want to do it. It's a very dangerous area to be in, because people just don't feel they want to put their neck on the line, or actually people are very busy in their everyday jobs. It takes a champion to stand up to do it. That's ridiculous. It's people in any organization can make the change if they want to make the change. And I use that word if very importantly, because I've seen a lot of circumstances where people say they want to make a change, but they don't. So, and they don't really want to make a change because there's no economic pressure or no social check or no motivation to do it. That's why I think I started this conversation off by saying there are lots of motivations to do it. It's not just good for brand. It's good for business. It's good for people. It's good for HR. It's just good. It's just a better industry and a better world. And it's all going to come to a head, particularly with, like we talked about, aging populations. We've talked about dwindling workforce. We've talked about younger people being far more woke and intolerant of this kind of thing than ever before. It's a very important thing to do.
Yeah. And I think I agree completely. And I think for many companies, if they don't see a good thing, then let's look at the risk mitigation. Let's look at it. What are the consequences if I don't do it? How could it cost you in terms of, look at the legal situation, look at the cases in massive companies like Goldman Sachs and Facebook and whatever not, due to whether discrimination or sexual harassment. It's going to cost you a lot of money. Yeah. And when it comes to accessibility laws that are also in Europe, implemented by the European Commission, if you don't follow them, if you don't really respect that, it's going to cost you a lot of money. So if you don't see positive side of DEI, then look at the negative side, what could come to you and bite you in your butt long term. And
I also think it's got to be throughout the organization. I've seen recently a lot of people hire what they call DEI managers or DEI directors or whatever it is. And I think, again, like I said, every step is a good step. However, a lot of these people don't have any power whatsoever. They're just put into that situation and they're not given a budget. They're not given any training. They don't have influence in marketing and sales. So if you are going to instill, a DEI person, a full-time DEI person, give them the tools they need to do their job really well.
Yeah, and don't just hire someone who's an intern, DI intern.
Yeah, or I often see in hotels, you make the gay person the person that's the liaison for the LGBT community, and that person happened to work at breakfast in the coffee shop, and all of a sudden they're given this responsibility to be the LGBTQ person with no budget, no training, no resources, no help. And then everybody pats on themselves on the back. Oh, we've got an LGBTQ liaison. We're a gay-friendly hotel. That's rubbish.
Yeah.
It's really something that needs to be developed more.
Wonderful. That's a nice way to kind of end our wonderful conversation. I think that I completely agree with that. With so many takeaways, so many different topics we have covered. And probably as a last thing that I'd like to ask you, what will be your recommendation to anyone working in the travel industry as the first simple recommendation, the first step they can take to implement something in their organization already starting tomorrow?
In the airline industry, I would say airlines should listen to real feedback of real passengers and go in depth, not just send a survey where you can, mark or evaluate your flight from 0 to 10. Go beyond that, ask questions and try to understand different groups. Work with consultants. There are so many professionals in this field. Like I see at least 3 on the screen today. They should really listen to professionals for those small steps, as Uwern said. I don't agree that it can change overnight, but I agree it starts with a small step. And small step, it's crucial. It's so hard to make the first step, but then every other step would be much easier. So my suggestion would be, to really listen to your passengers, get quality feedbacks, work with professionals, and start with something small, because eventually this small will lead to a better world of travel, I believe.
Thank you, Alex. Rosina?
I always like to start with kind of promoting this idea of intercultural awareness and intelligence, because I really believe, I think when you take a hotel, and people often ask me outside of the industry, what is it that you love about hotels? I love hotels. I love spending time in them. I love going when they are a building site and seeing them develop into this amazing property that attracts all these people from all over the world coming in, eating together, sleeping in the same building, kind of having these interactions. And they are like this, the phrase, they are cultural melting pots. They really, really are, from the workforce and with the guests as well. And I think with that, and with the diverse people coming through the door, you have all these different cultures. And that's why I recommend starting with having and promoting intercultural awareness. And you can do that through training. So understanding the cultural needs of your staff, first and foremost, will then support you with implementing effective and authentic diversity, equity, and inclusion for your staff. Then once you have supported your staff with their needs and they feel like they have this really great sense of belonging, anything is then going to come into the guest experience. But then it also gives you the opportunity to look also at the guest experience as well and see how you can develop that, looking at the source markets of your destination. Where are the people coming from? And again, working with experts who really understand the topics, but also hospitality and travel, because this niche it's particular, and it attracts passionate people that work in hospitality for a very long time, where you get bitten by the bug, really, with hotels, with travel, with hospitality. And when you worked in it, it really helps you understand it from the inside. And also then, as I mentioned earlier, if you're a GM or if you're a leader in the hospitality industry, get out on the floor, go and work in the other departments. Really, I can't recommend it enough. And it will transform your perspective on how you run your business and how you support your staff.
Beautiful tips. Thank you very much. And Uwern?
I would say my key tip is to educate yourself. Knowledge is power. It really is. And I think this kind of feeds off what Rosina is saying. Just constantly experiencing, gaining that life experience that we've talked about so much, eliminating the unconscious bias that you have, because knowledge is important. Speak to as many people as possible. Get in front of experts. I think all of this is being covered. Attend industry events in the industry. Rosina is actually going to come and join me in London on March the 18th at an event that we're hosting called Icons of Inclusion, which is all about promoting a culture of inclusivity and belonging in the luxury travel industry. There are lots of events like that. Lots of little groups, whether it's women in hospitality or LGBTQ people like the IJLTA, the Black Travel Alliance. There are lots of groups where you can go and learn or be mentored, or not even be mentored, have a conversation with people who have the life experience. Those resources do exist, and more so now than ever before. So clue up, give yourself the knowledge that you need. And I think once you have that knowledge, it will open your eyes and it will help you see how you can make change in your organization.
Yeah. And don't be afraid to make mistakes, because you can only, don't be afraid to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, because we're all learning. I'm making mistakes in diversity inclusion all the time, and I'm, supposed to be an expert, right? But it's normal. We all have our own biases. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much all for your contributions and thoughts. Beautiful, beautiful conversation. Have a fantastic day, and I'll talk to you later.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Brilliant. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you for listening. If you have any feedback, recommendations, or would like to be a speaker in our next episode, reach out via hi@BeamReach-inclusion.com. Also, if you need our expertise with diversity inclusion training, would like us to conduct a comprehensive audit, or need a helping hand with DI strategy, don't be shy and get in touch. Stay tuned, and until the next episode.